for a short time into Isaiah chapter 4. Yeah. We're gonna tag team you guys tonight. It'll be fun. It's like WWE.
Nice.
I don't know. I don't know. Is it like that?
Are we gonna wrestle?
We're gonna wrestle.
That's good.
So, have you
No.
have you ever had a word from God that made no sense to you? A prophecy or something that you felt like you're hearing from God, and that it just, I have, and actually, I actually have them routinely. Mm-hmm. And you're like, what? You're a pastor. You should get it all the time. Well, actually, you kind of push. I feel like if you're not pushing to the point of failure, like in exercising, like our trainer up here will let you know that if you're not pushing to the point of failure, sometimes you're not growing. Uh-huh. If you don't push your muscles to failure, your muscles will never grow. It's the same with hearing from God, and it's the same with any area of our life where we're actually growing. We push beyond what we've done before in order to grow. And so there's times when God pushes us and he gives us things that we don't understand in order for us to press into him more. So how does prophecy work? Well, before I say that, I want to say this. When God gives me a word that I don't understand, it gets me really excited because I know that there's more. I'm like, oh, this is good. It's going to be good. I don't know when it's going to be good, but at some point, there's going to be more. So how does it work? About 27% of the Bible is prophecy. That's huge. Like more than 8,000 verses in the Bible are prophetic.
Wow.
Prophecy. You're talking about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. You got all these prophets. You got Revelation, and all these different things in Psalms that are prophetic. So yet so many of the prophetic books are shrouded in mystery for people. And I was actually at my class in Springfield in June, and there was a kid who was there in the student lounge every day, and so I kept passing him, and so I started a conversation with him, and started talking to him multiple times. And finally, he opened up to me, and he's like, yeah, I'm reading Isaiah, and I don't really understand I don't understand anything I'm reading. And I just started talking with him about that a little bit, and I felt like the Lord showed me, to ask him, have you ever been prophesied over? Because it's kind of hard to understand prophecy unless you've experienced it.
Gotcha, right.
It's kind of hard to understand a vision from God and reading about visions from God unless you've been experiencing a vision from God at some point in your life. It kind of makes more sense. And so he was like, well, actually, no, I've never been prophesied over. So he's like, can I pray for? So I asked him if I could pray for him. I'm going to prophesy over him for a minute. And I feel like there was some breakthrough in his understanding. But how you understand prophecy and visions if you've never had one, if you've never been prophesied over, is a little surprising. It's a spiritual understanding. And so there's something to that. So I think we can understand more about that. You're going to experience the scripture better. These things are spiritually discerned. The best understanding I have of these things comes from when I remember the visions that God's given me and the prophetic words that God's given me. And that's when I recognize, oh, wait, sometimes they deal with things that have already happened.
Right.
They always have a present thing that I'm supposed to be doing with them. And sometimes they have something that's way in the future. Sometimes they have something that's just a little bit in the future. Sometimes they have multiple levels of fulfillment that's going to happen. And that's the same way the prophecies in Scripture work. And this has been true of the prophecies that I've had over my own life. So we're going to Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2. And if you're there in your Bible, it says this. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy, all who are recorded among the living in Jerusalem. Now, he's saying something about the Israelites that was not presently true of them. Now, put you into the context of this book is that Isaiah was prophesying to a nation that was very rebellious, and far from God. They were
Not holy.
yeah. They were religious, but they weren't good. They weren't right with God. They weren't honoring God. They weren't honoring people. And and they were also worshiping idols and doing all kind of craziness. He says this about them when it's not true of them yet. You will be called holy. Okay? So let me go to verse 4. The Lord will wash away the filth of the women of Zion. You have to go back into verse 3 to understand or chapter 3, to understand the reference there. But there's a lot about that in there. He will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire. Basically, he's talking about the bloodstains, the violence that was going on in Jerusalem. It was a very violent time, and they were being oppressive of their neighbors with violence. So, then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion and over all those who assemble there a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. Over everything, the glory will be a canopy. So there's a few phrases in there that are going to be important. He says he will create, and this basically a reference to, he's taking them back to being a baby. You're going to be a little baby, and he's going to create, and take you back to that place, the incubator of the wilderness, because now they're hundreds of years away from when they were in the wilderness.
An incubator too.
Yeah, right. But they're hundreds of years from that time period in Israel's history, and he's like, we're going to take you back there and create you into this baby nation again. So, and then he says, but he's doing this over specifically those who assemble. And in Jerusalem, this was fulfilled in Jerusalem, how actually on the day of Pentecost, where there's the smoke and the fire, there's the fire over people's heads. This was specifically fulfilled over those who assembled on the day of Pentecost. Okay? But he's talking about those who assembled and all who assembled in the upper room. Now, God favors those who assemble. And all of you are like, amen, we're here assembling tonight. We're assembling. God favors you because you're here. You're assembling in his name. It doesn't seem right for God to favor people just for showing up, but he does. It doesn't seem right that 90% of the battle in education is just kids showing up to school. But if you talk to people in education, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Kids showing up to school. That's what matters so much. It doesn't seem right that families that just keep showing up in each other's lives do better financially. But that's just the truth. Families that stick together and have unity in that way do better financially. It doesn't seem right that to come to a funeral and just be there and listen to someone's story about their relative and be there for them and look them in the eye and give them a hug, that's really what they need from you. But that's really what they need from you. Most of the time, is not to try and say anything, but to be there. Okay? And that's so much of the battle is just showing up, because God favors those who assemble. What do you need to show up for? Who do you need to show up for? I mean, it doesn't seem right that God will speak to you just because you show up asking him to speak to you. But he does. You show up in his presence and he's going to begin to communicate with you. That's what he does. And this is what makes the glory possible. It's the gathering. It says, all who assemble.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Exodus, I love the picture we see here. It's almost like a reminder to them of what used to be, and this rebirth that he's saying, like, I'm going to create, and we're going to go back to when you were a baby. But as they were wandering in the wilderness, it's exactly what God did, is so that they could travel, whether it was day or night. He put a cloud over them so that they wouldn't burn up in the heat of the day. And then at night, to keep them warm, he gives them a fire so they can see what's happening. They could travel through the night. And it's interesting for them. This is such a reminder of how do we move forward. Because it literally says that this is the way that they could travel at any time. how do we move forward in life? And he's saying, hey, right now, we can't move forward. He's trying to create a safe place for them. Again, I think it's interesting, like you said, to just show up. And we get this at CrossFit. You know, the people who attend, they see progress. They get to see forward motion. They get to see the journey actually happen for them. And it's, you know, why would God favor that? Because that's how things grow. Is its consistency. That's literally like a thing of nature, the way that he really values that. I believe that in all aspects. It's not just in fitness, it's not just in spiritual life, it's in all things, that if we show up and put in the work, we're going to see progress. He wants to bless that. But I love that he's reminding them that the glory will be this canopy. It's going to cover you. Like, if you come into this place with me, it is safe. It's I'm going to bless you and be there for you. In verse 6, it says, it will be a shelter and shade from the heat of day, and a refuge and hiding place from the storm and rain. They hear this and think, man, if only. Like, God, if only you could do this for us now, because right now we see bloodshed and we see, you know, just morals decreasing around us. There's all this, you know, just messed up things happening around us in our life. And I can imagine they ask the question, like when they hear this, like, well, God, then how do we get this gift back? How do we get this promise that we once enjoyed as your people, and that we could actually feel that? Because right now, this is just strictly prophetic. This isn't like he's like, oh, I'm going to be with you right now. He's saying, no, I have this for you. And they're questioning, well, then how do we get back there? And the real question is, should they get back there, I think? Like, should they even be able to enjoy this? I think Jared had said it a few weeks ago when he had taken the manna away from them and stopped providing. It was so that they could literally go into the promised land.
Yeah.
Like that, he had to remove provision in that way to give them promise, though. And so when I think of progress is, should they go back to being a baby? They kind of have to, he's saying, like, man, you guys have lacked maturity in this for now. So yeah, we're going to go back, but I can almost see it right now in his prophetic mind is so that we can only get back to a better place in the future, that we don't have to come back to being a baby. Like, that's not the goal, is to always regress. He wants progress. He wants us to be moving forward. And so it's a beautiful thing to see that he's already speaking this over them, though. It's like, for now, we'll go back. I'll cover you again. We're going to learn. We're going to build. We're going to come back to a place where you can be sustainable as a nation and mature. And then in chapter 5, we'll move on to Isaiah 5, verse 1. He says, I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside.
So it's interesting. Isaiah calls God his loved one, which was different language than most people in Israel used at that time. He's the mighty one, he's the fearsome one, but he's the loved one. That's pretty interesting. Isaiah expresses love for the one who is love, and we find out that later after the revelation of Jesus Christ. So describing that, he's describing it in song now. Isaiah was a musician and a singer, and he says he sings in verse 2. I'm not going to sing it for you.
Oh, man, come on.
I didn't practice. Come on. No, it's not. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it. So he's talking about the vineyard now, with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Now God's speaking here. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? What more could have been done? In other words, God did everything he could possibly do in this moment for this vineyard. You know, God is caring for the vineyard in every way possible, loving it, loving his people. He dug it up, which is tilling the soil. So you take the soil, it gets turned around, flipped over, messed with, crunched together, and then put back right back down where it was. That's what tilling is. But now it's more useful. You know, and some of you have experienced that in your life.
Right.
You got turned around, disoriented, flipped over, crunched together in crazy ways, and then put back down where you were, and you're like, what just happened? What if God's tilling you and preparing you for more usefulness? He dug it up, he cleared it. So much of becoming who God's called us to be is in clearing out who God's not called us to be. and clearing out the things in our life that are not helpful. Okay, so he cleared it. Then he planted it, and he planted the best, the choicest vines there. And this is prophecy. This is talking about prophecy, the plantings of the Lord, what God was planting inside of people and saying, this is who you are, this is who you're called to be as a people. He prophesied through Abraham, you're supposed to bless the entire world. He prophesied through Moses, you serve one God and he favors you when you trust him, when you obey him. He prophesied through David, this is what a personal relationship with me looks like. And there's blessing in that. I will bless you when you know me and when you don't run after idols. Those are the kinds of things that he was speaking through each of these different prophets, and lots of prophets throughout the years, Samuel and all of them. And God had planted all those words, and he was declaring this over the people of Israel and planting in them. And then he sets up a watchtower. That's prophets and seers who guarded and kept the people on the right track. He set up the wine press. They were supposed to produce more fruit, and they were supposed to bless other nations and influence other people to know God in other nations. So that's why they were supposed to export their fruit. Fruit was supposed to go out. They were supposed to export the wine, the blessing to others. But instead, they were simply constantly being influenced by others and being led toward idols. So.
And it's fun to watch Isaiah kind of build from where we start, like he said, and you could read in chapter 3 who they were as a nation at that time. And then you get to chapter 4 and 5, they just seem so out of place in this story of what you see of becoming really a very judgment-based type of prophecy. Like, there was a lot that he had to deal with in them and kind of bring up to the front. And it's like interesting to hear him talk about flipping and like turning over the soil, getting it to just kind of like disorient and then flop right back to where it was. But isn't that what we hear in this where he's saying like to create again? It's like, wait, we're just going to go right back to where we were as a baby, and like, how do we start back at the beginning? But he kind of, it's like he's giving us different ways to relate to this message. And I remember it's so interesting because he'll go into later in Isaiah 45, actually, the chapter, it talks about the potter and the clay. And I know a lot of us can relate to this, I'm sure. But I remember a very personal time where I had this vision where I felt like I was getting, like, if you could imagine like a pot being made, and then I felt like I was getting smushed, and then it'd be made again, and then just smushed. And I was like, God, why do you keep smushing me? Like, I don't understand why you just keep like smushing it down and starting over. Am I doing something wrong? And that was kind of my question. And it's interesting in Isaiah 45, verse 9, it says, woe to him who strives with him who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles. I didn't ask it in a way of being mad or striving by any means. I wanted to understand. And I was like, what does it, like, why is this the vision you're giving me? And I think it's interesting because as a rebirth, if we look back at like what he was doing when he was creating, I think it's better than just like starting over, as much as like if you think about a potter and they're making something, if there's an imperfection in it, you can't just keep trying to smooth it out because the clay will become too thin. It'll become like, it'll just flop over anyway. So it's going to collapse if he just keeps forming. It's like, nope, we got to deal with the clay we have, smush it down, and in his mind, he has an image of what righteousness looks like. He's like, no, the right thing I want, okay, I did this, imperfections were there, smush, and then let me make what I really want. And I think that's so cool to think about, is like he was saying, clearing out the things that shouldn't be there to make room for the things that should be. And so he's kind of re-saying it in a different way of like later in the book and in the prophecy is like as a potter making out of clay, he can say, I'm going to not destroy it necessarily, but I am going to do something is I'm going to start back from the clay and I'm going to build what I meant and what I'm hoping for, this progression towards perfection. That's really the goal. And I think in all of us, that's God's heart for us is I don't want to start over. I want to progress towards perfection. And sometimes I have to deal with imperfections. It might feel like you're being like judged harshly or destroyed and like, why, oh God, why? No, it's a beautiful thing to see that he has a vision for your life. I really believe that, and it's good. And so verse 5, as we pick up in Isaiah 5, it says, oh, my man, thing's broken. What's that start with?
Isaiah 5:5.
Now
Now.
I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its walls, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned or cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but heard cries of distress.
So things didn't work out so well for the vineyard, okay? Because the vineyard wasn't producing, and in fact, you see all through chapter 2 and 3, and in the rest of chapter 5, you see why it wasn't producing, and God goes into great detail as to what he was not pleased with. He was very specific in terms of the violence, in terms of the oppression, in terms of people lording it over those who were poor, in terms of the drunkenness and the haughtiness and the pride and the injustice that was in their justice system. That's what he was angry about, and it wasn't because they were not being right to the people around them. They're not acting correctly. So this prophetic picture then of the branch of the Lord, the branch of the Lord that's in the vineyard, all this kind of stuff, this picture, it rests in Isaiah's mind for a while, and a number of years at least. And as someone who's experienced pictures from God before, you'll find that that's typical. Sometimes you get a picture from God and it just kind of like sits. And maybe you write it down, maybe you remember it somehow, but it just kind of sits there for a while, and sometimes you don't really know what to do with it.
Right.
Okay? And I don't think that Isaiah really had full understanding at this point. He had understanding for the kind of prophecy that the people needed in that moment, but I think it took a number of years before this comes to mind, and then in Isaiah chapter 11, the branch comes back into his mind. In Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, he says this, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit." So now he's added the texture that this is from Jesse. So this wasn't in the Isaiah 4 prophecy, but it's the same picture. Now he's got more detail. This is from Jesse. Now every Israelite knew exactly what that meant.
Right.
That's king. That's talking about King David, the line of the kings. Jesse was David's father, and so this meant royalty. Shoot, the branch was royalty. It's a powerful thing. Verse 11:2, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord." Now, it's interesting that some of the scholars and theologians will try to argue that Isaiah chapter 4 is not talking about the Messiah. But nobody argues that about Isaiah chapter 11. I don't understand, because it's the same picture.
Right.
You've got the branch. It's the same picture. There's no way that if 11 is about the Messiah, then 4 has to be. It's the same guy prophesying about the same picture that he's seeing years later. And if you've ever experienced prophecy, you know that's how God works. He'll give you more detail, and it might be years later, but he's going to give you more detail. He's going to give you more insight. He's going to give you something that makes that picture more vivid, that makes it work for you, that makes it breathe life into your situation now. So that's what's happening. The branch of the Lord is the Messiah. When he comes, that's when it's possible for the glory of the Lord to be a canopy. We talked about in chapter 4. At this point, Isaiah's readers have a pretty good understanding, and I bet they're pretty excited about this prophecy. He's prophesying about the Messiah. They're like, the spirit of counsel and wisdom and knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Yeah, that's the guy we want. We want that guy. We want him ruling Israel. We want him leading the armies, taking us into battle, destroying all our enemies.
I feel like it's like we're picking for like dodgeball or something.
Yeah, right.
I want that guy.
I want that guy. That's it.
I want that guy.
So then, probably a lot of years later, maybe 40 years later, Isaiah gets the picture again. Isaiah chapter 53, and Abby read it during our communion time.
Right.
But she didn't read the first couple verses, so I'm going to jump into those. Isaiah 53:1 says, "Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot." It's the same word, the branch, okay? Same word in the Hebrew. and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. At this point, if they're hearing the prophecy, if the Israelites are hearing the prophecy, they're like, okay, this is still good. We're talking about the Messiah, the branch, the spirit of counsel and wisdom. We remember the last one in Isaiah. This is good. And so, he's nothing that we should desire him. All right, fine, whatever. He's ugly, fine. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, and yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And they're like, you know what? We can take the last line, but what were you talking about with the rest of that stuff? You obviously missed God with the rest of that prophecy, Isaiah. This is what the Israelites are probably thinking. No, and in fact, many Jewish scholars, non-Messianic Jews, people who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but Jewish scholars today look at Isaiah 53 and don't believe that refers to the Messiah. We'll interpret that as not referring to the Messiah. Why? Because it involves suffering and punishment. They don't see that as part of his makeup. But the branch of the Lord is a little more complicated than people wanted to think. And all of these things were amazingly fulfilled in Jesus. Okay? So, we know that this is prophetic fulfillment. And this is probably 40 years later, Isaiah gets more clarification about this picture. And these are the concepts that I'd encourage you. If you've ever heard me speak about some of these subjects before, if you ever get a word from God, think in mosaics. Mosaics are like those little square pictures that you put, and you put a ton of them on there, and all of a sudden you make this giant picture based on these little tiny squares. So everything that you get from the Lord is like a little square, and you put it up on there, and you're like, I don't know what that means. I need to get the other squares around it. Lord, help me get the other squares around it. And then he'll show you one that's over here, and you're like, I still don't know what that means. And so then you start painting. God paints the picture for you as you lean into his heart, because it's all really about relationship with him. We want the answer. We want the end result, and he just wants our heart. So he gives us pieces so that we'll be intrigued, so that we'll dive into his heart. So think in mosaics and then play the long game. I mean, this prophecy, this one picture from God, took 40 years to develop in Isaiah's heart and mind. And then write them down.
Yeah, write them down. I would really encourage that. I actually got the opportunity to be blessed by looking at the long game of prophecy. So one of the things, it was 2003 was the original word that I remember the prayer time. I actually remember writing this down. I was sitting, at this time I used to sit at the edge of my bed all the time like this, and I would just like kind of write things on a little notepad I had. So then I transferred it all to my computer about like 3 years ago. And so I was looking through some things. In 2003, there was a word about like really impacting my community. And it was interesting because like I always had a heart for school. So like when I graduated high school, I was the only person who would let me come back to their class was my anatomy teacher at the time, Mr. Junkie, and he would let me do a rap I wrote about anatomy. So it was like an anatomy song. If you want to look it up, it's actually online. If you look up anatomy rap Dustin Taylor, you can watch it on your own time. It's pretty interesting too. But anyway, so he'd let me come in. I did it for 3 years straight, but that was all I had. It felt like no influence. Like, what was the point? I was young still. I was like 19, 20, and 21, I think is the years I got to go in. And but I remember writing this word down because I would have been 18 at this time, still in high school, and God was like, hey, I want you to impact your communities by getting into schools, meeting with like high-level, like not politicians, I don't know the right word, but anyway, like being around those type of people who actually make decisions in the community. And so I wrote it down. 14 years later, I'm looking at it. It makes so much more sense now because of like many of the things that I actually currently do, just practices, like going into the schools. And the other day, the principal at the junior high pulled me into a meeting where they were trying to figure out like why some of the students are like being mean to their teachers and like saying some really hurtful things. It's creating a lot of tension. They're not getting their schoolwork done. And so he had pulled me in, and then him and I have this email thread going back and forth of like, he's just asking my advice, like, why do you think they're doing it? And like that word makes so much more sense now at 32 than it made at 18, being still in high school. But like I knew God was saying something, and it was like a really long game of like, I'm so glad I wrote it down though, because it was like him moving me in a direction. It's like no wonder I have this passion for students, because it all started back then. And it might have been one simple step of like, that makes no sense, God. I'm in high school. How could I ever influence anybody who's in these settings? But I'm sure I took one step. And those steps just built over years. And now I can look back at it and be like, oh, so much more sense, God. So thank you. So writing them down, I would encourage that for sure.
So now this is really fun. What happens from here is that the Isaiah dies. He prophesies for like 50 plus years, probably 60 years, about 60 years in Israel. And then he gets finally martyred by wicked King Manasseh. And then, so the branch prophecy is probably done, right? Nope. Jeremiah 23:5. Jeremiah picks up the mantle of this prophecy 100 years later. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. So a king now, this is added to the whole concept. We have this idea of king. Jeremiah goes on in chapter 33, verse 15. In those days, that time I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land. Similar concept. Zechariah continues on, even farther down the line. Zechariah 3:8. Listen, high priest Joshua, you and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come, I am going to bring my servant, the branch. Okay? He continues on in chapter 6, verse 12. Tell him, this is what the Lord Almighty says, here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will branch out from his place and build the temple of the Lord. So now this king from Jeremiah is going to rebuild the temple. It's awesome. So every Israelite is like super excited about this. And then Jesus comes along and they're like, I don't know if you're the guy. Okay? But Jesus says this in John chapter 15. He adds to the same prophecy. John chapter 15, I am the true vine. He's the branch. It's the same word if you go back and trace it. And my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Now, then you think it's done with Jesus, right? No. Paul picks it up in Romans 15:12. He says, and again, Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will spring up. So he's quoting Isaiah there. And then in Revelation, John, the apostle, picks it up in his prophecy about the end of time. He says, then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root or the branch of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scrolls and its 7 seals. And then again in Revelation 22:6, at the very end of the end, Jesus is speaking through the prophet John. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star. Now, that prophecy just exploded, right?
Right.
It just got huge. Now the root is the bright and morning star. This is even bigger. It's even more important. Because there are some Jewish theories about the Messiah that he wasn't even going to be a divine figure, but he was just a human who was going to lead them to victory and restore the kingship to Israel. Well, now Jesus is like, that's actually not what this whole branch thing is all about. It's about me, and I'm the bright and morning star. So it's cool to see the thread throughout Scripture, but don't miss this. The prophets vamp off of each other. Jeremiah picked up the baton from Isaiah and was like, oh, God just showed me that picture too.
Right.
But this time, it's also about, and this is something that happened in the Old Testament a lot, and that happened in the early church a lot, is that prophets would get together, and one would prophesy and someone else would give something, and they'd learn off of each other, and they'd grow from each other, and they'd define and figure out and discern whether or not that was from God and kind of figure out what was happening there. Prophetic words are best done in community. There's clarification from others, and there's life from that. In my life group on Sunday night, in our life group on Sunday night, we had we did like a hot seat thing where we put someone in the center of the room, and everybody just took a minute and listened for God's voice for that person. Like literally 1 minute, we all took 1 minute, and then we just shared. And this person was new to the group, so no one knew her, and God had given a couple people a word about like a mechanic, maybe being a car, or it had to do with a car mechanic, and she's
wears
like
glasses,
and they were talking
beard,
about no.
blonde hair. No, guess who?
Yeah, right. Guess who? Yeah, it was like kind of like that. Well, they're and about her husband, and is he a mechanic was the question that was coming out. And then when it came around to me, I was like, God gave me the word airplane. I don't know what that means. And then he told me about a little sprout out of the ground and the encouragement that goes along with that. And she's like, her face dropped when I said the word airplane because he's an airplane mechanic. So she was like, he's kind of a mechanic. When they were talking about mechanic earlier, he's kind of a mechanic. And then when I said airplane, she's like, huh? What? What just happened here? Because now it was evident to everybody in the room that God was involved. Because he gave each of us in the room a piece of the picture. Her husband wasn't in the room, but we were praying about him. And we began to then encourage her. And the encouragement had power because she knew that God knew her address.
That's really good.
She
Yeah.
knew that God knew where she was at, what she was dealing with. She knew that God cared about her husband even more than she does. And so now the prophetic encouragement was like, it had punch to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we were talking about this, I had this image of like organic peanut butter, and this will make sense in a moment. So if you ever had organic peanut butter, when you open it, all the oil is on top. And if you don't manage that oil properly, the whole thing is pretty much ruined, at least the bottom third of it. So what you have to do is you have to puncture down, open up a little gap, let the oil get down to the bottom, open up another little gap, let the oil get down to the bottom. Usually it's best to do 4 of them, and then you start stirring. But if you start stirring too early and it's just at the top, oil gets out of the thing. You have to wipe off the side. I know this is like a real thing. If you've never done it, this is real. And it gets on the side. You've wasted some of the oil. And you get to the bottom of that jar, and you don't get to use it anymore. It's way too hard. And I feel like it's interesting when it's done right in prophecy and you're starting to hear these things, is like when you hear these words and you give them, is you're kind of like piercing down, opening it up, letting things settle in, so that when you start to actually give the encouraging words, it's like super smooth and it like sits well and it's like useful and effective. And I love that image. It's like, oh, that makes so much more sense. Peanut butter. Peanut butter.
So we were praying for, I was praying for a guy at the altar on Sunday, and praying and encouraging, and just, praying kind of a general prayer over him because he had expressed some needs and that kind of thing. But it wasn't breaking through. I could tell his face, like, he was expressing needs about wrong things in his life, and his face was still like,
He had the hard peanut
stuff
butter
is
face?
wrong.
Hard
Yeah,
peanut
the
face,
peanut
okay.
butter is
He had
a hard peanut butter face. Stuff was still wrong. It hadn't broken through, and God just kept, I just kept sensing a lower back pain, and I'm like, oh, and it didn't lock in right away, and then I'm like, oh, okay, I need to ask him if he has lower back pain. So I asked him if he has lower back pain. He's like, yeah, I've had lower back pain for a long time, and I'm like, I feel like the Lord showed me, and then I get more courage when it's right the first time. So I feel like the Lord showed me that you had an accident 14 years ago, and he's like, yeah, I was chopping wood about 14 years ago, and I had an accident. And so God wouldn't tell me that stuff unless he wants to heal it. And so we prayed for the back pain, and then his countenance has changed. And then I'm praying for all the other stuff, the emotional stuff, and the things that are going on in his life. And all of a sudden, like, God's already done the work in him. Like, it's like, and so I'm pouring encouragement into him, but God's already been encouraging his heart because he knows where he's at. He knows who he is. He knows what he's been struggling with, and there's confirmation of that. It's authenticated.
Right.
The word that's gone on in him. So this is the power of those kind of encounters. This is the power of when God when you go after it and when you lean in, even to the point of failure, with growing muscles, like even to the point where you're like, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right. I don't know. Do you have lower back pain?
Yeah, right.
It's one of those things, and it breaks through in an awesome way.
Yeah, and it's good. Like I really feel like they are the things that sustain us as Christians. Words from God, like legitimate words from God. They're things that you can count on and hold on to. And what I would encourage is, if you were like me, when they don't make sense, it's so easy to dismiss them and throw them out. And so what I want to pray for you guys tonight is, if you have and you didn't write them down, is I want you to like rediscover those words that he had for you then. I want him to speak that again to your heart, and I want you to write them down this time. And regardless of where you're at in the journey, maybe you'll be like, wow, I remember you saying that to me and it makes sense. Or, wow, I remember you saying that to me and I could see how that might make sense in the future. Like he was saying, sometimes they're for the past, sometimes they're for the present, sometimes for the close future, and sometimes for the distant future. And so my prayer is that we will find those hidden things, or those things we've shoved away or totally dismissed, like, that is not right, God. You just like questioned it beyond belief. And I want clarity to come for that. And I really do. And I believe that there will be, that it'll actually mean something for your life, and that you can hold on to it, and how it could actually challenge you to move forward. Because that's what they're for. It's like he has vision for our lives, and it's good. It's always good. It's really good, in fact. And so that's what we want, is to help you rediscover that. And then he has another practice that could be really fun.
Well, let's have the musicians come forward right now, and we're going to get into that. So rediscover, and just pray about that right now as they're coming. Remember a word from God, maybe something that God's directed you with in the past, and or maybe you want to seek him for one right now, but write something down. That would be the key piece right now. Just take a few minutes as the musicians are getting ready.
Yeah.
Come. Thank you, God. So now what I want you to do is I want you to get with 4 to 6 people. So get in groups of 4 or 3, 4, 5, 6. Get in little groups, all right? And what we're gonna do is you're gonna practice. You're gonna hot seat somebody, okay? So somebody's gonna volunteer to be like the one being prayed for, and everybody else is going to listen for God's voice for them and pray for them. So, ready? Stand up from your seats. Get in little groups. Let's do this. And when you're done with this, you can feel free to go. That's fine.
the Lord, oh my soul. Oh, my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I worship your holy name. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh, my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I worship your holy name. So bless the Lord, oh my soul.